Our next phylum is annelids, and these are segmented worms. Annelids are distinct from the platyhelminthes, which were the types of worms that you saw last week, which included the flatworms and the tapeworms. These guys are different. Segmented worms are distinguished because they have segmented bodies. So as you'll see, each segment has kind of its own set of organs and its own set of things going on. So this category would include earthworms, which is probably the worm you're most accustomed to seeing. There's over 9,000 species of annelids, so they're pretty common. And if we look at the inside of their body, so if you were to take an earthworm and cut it in half, this is what you would see. Each of these individual pieces is its own little segment, its own little slice of the worm. And each segment contains basically a full set of functioning parts. So now what happens is some organs run through the entire worm, and you see them in each segment. So for example, the intestine, the crop, and then the stomach, which are kind of almost one piece together. And the dorsal and ventral nerve cords run through the entire worm. But basically, each segment kind of has its own heart. So each of these little red rings is a heart, which is kind of cool. Each segment also has its own excretory system. So this green thing here is called the metanephridium. And the metanephridium deals with waste. So it's basically the kidneys of the worm, and they excrete it through tiny little pores on each segment. So basically, the worm can pee through every little segment of its body, which is kind of cool. They have a one-way gut, so here's the mouth. Food goes in one way, is digested, and then is pooped out through the anus at the end. So a one-way gut is also a characteristic that's important to this phylum. Sometimes they can be venomous, and we're going to look at the different classes within this phylum. So there are some types of annelids that are venomous or dangerous. Other types are pretty harmless. The whole phylum consists of polychaetes, earthworms, tube worms, roundworms, beardworms, and spoonworms, and we'll be looking at each of these guys. The first class, these are polychaetes. These are the most common annelid. We see them a lot in the marine environment, and these are also some of the most brightly colored and interesting looking annelids. So this includes sandworms, feather duster worms like these guys here, lungworms, and they can either be free swimming, or the word for that is errant, so they swim and wiggle through the water, or they can be sedentary. So these guys are sessile, they stay attached to objects. They have a long tube of protein that makes up their little home, their little tube. And what they do is they can stick out these feather-like appendages that they use for filter feeding. And then if a predator comes by, they might recoil and pull their little appendages in and retract. So the tubes, again, they can be made of protein. Sometimes they're made of calcium carbonate. The errant or free-swimming polychaetes, they don't have this type of mechanism. Usually they're predatory, so they're not going to be filter feeding. They're going to be carnivorous. And they often have little jaws or teeth for that. So this is what it might look like. So this might be a free-swimming polychaete with its little jaws and teeth. Sometimes they'll eat algae that way too, so it's not always necessarily carnivores that have these. Some of them actually, some of the filter feeders can actually weave a web of mucus, and that mucus also helps them to take in food. It kind of allows them to stick onto little bits of food. Some are also deposit feeders. So earthworms, for example, are deposit feeders. They bury down into the sand or dirt, and they will actually eat all kinds of things. They'll eat inorganic and organic substances, but then they'll only absorb the organic parts and they'll poop out the inorganic. They call this non-selective feeding. So they're not selective. They're taking in basically everything and keeping the organic stuff and pooping out the non-organic or inorganic stuff. So if we take another close look at one of their segments here, this is the little pore, the little nephridium is what it's called, where waste comes out. So this is their entire kidney system here, the metanephridia, and here's a bladder, and then waste comes out through the little pore. So every single segment has one of those. As far as reproduction goes, some will reproduce asexually by way of budding or regenerating, and most of them, though, reproduce sexually, so they have separate genders. They'll just shed gametes into the water, and then the fertilization occurs there. But there are some types of free-swimming polychaetes that have a really interesting mating behavior. They call this epitoky, and a lot of scientists have tried to get out and see this firsthand and scuba dive or snorkel when this is happening. But basically what happens is males and females will rise to the surface at night, and they secrete a hormone that's like a big signal that tells each other to release their gametes. So they release their egg and sperm into the water, and then that's where fertilization happens, and it's a big swarming behavior. And then what can happen sometimes, sometimes the female will grow a long tail of egg segments, or the male will grow a long tail of sperm segments, and those float in the water as well. So pretty interesting ways of reproducing. Another class of annelids are spoonworms. This is class Echuria. These guys look like little sausages, and then they have this little plume at the end, also for deposit or filter feeding. These guys are known for making that little bit of mucus on the inside to help stick to little bits of nutrients. And so they burrow down into the sediment. So this, if the sediment were right here, the proboscis, or the filter feeding appendage, would stick out through the sediment, and then the rest of the worm would be buried below. And these guys can pump water at a rate of about 1 liter per hour. And that's incredible. I mean, can you imagine trying to drink 1 liter of water per hour? I mean, you can do it, but it's not going to be terribly comfortable if you do it all day. The next class are paganophores. Paganophora, this is going to be beardworms and tube worms. So these guys live in tubes in the ocean floor. They have a cylinder, often with a ring of tentacles or a proboscis at one end. And what's amazing about tube worms in particular, you've seen these guys before when we studied a little bit about hydrothermal vents. These are the tube worms. And these guys have no digestive system. All they have is the chemosynthetic bacteria living in their gut that they do symbiosis with. So the chemosynthetic bacteria is in their gut, and the worm has this nice plume that sticks out through the top. The plume will take in dissolved nutrients, and it'll also take in inorganic minerals coming out of the vents, and that is what the bacteria use to do chemosynthesis. So these guys are entirely dependent upon the bacteria for food. It's pretty amazing. All right, and so that is all for Phylum Annelida.